I want to thank Dr. Saeed Ganji as well for having us and for assembling what I believe will be a fantastic panel. My philosophy of moderation is that moderators should be seen but not heard. And what I want to do is therefore catalyze a conversation with Ladan, with Mehdi, with Mohammad about what I think really is a striking situation in Iran with simply the growth and the frequency of the protest movement. Now, my first trip to Iran was in 1996, and in 1999, when I went back, of course, Iran at the time had erupted into massive nationwide protests, the largest protests in 20 years. And then we had protests in 2001, 2009, and now it seems that protests, Ladan, are happening every year, if not every month and every week. And so is my impression correct that we really have an increasing rapidity and frequency of these protests? And if so, what's really behind it?
Yes, we do. Actually, in the last months, human rights activists in Iran registered 354 protests around Iran. From, everybody is protesting, factory workers, teachers, mine workers, retirees. I mean, there is no social category that is not discontent. And these daily protests are not noticed by the world. But then every now and then, every year, every 2 years, you see paroxysmal episode like 2017, 2018, like 2019, or the water protest in Khuzestan last summer, and recently in Isfahan. These are huge protests that point to bad governance and endemic corruption.
But why now? I mean, why the frequency now? Mohammed, is it because of the economy?
So before I answer your question, a couple of things. Everything that I say are my personal opinions, and everything that I quote here are based on publicly available data. The only question is that how to put them together. So about the economic point of view, let's actually keep in mind that in year 2000, the nominal income of Iran per person was equal to the average of the world and that of the Middle East. 22 years later, Iran has stagnated while the average for the world and for the Middle East has grown. So at the point that Iran was the average country in the region, now it is not the average country anymore, and this is continuing. It has a meaning. It essentially means that the average worker who entered the job market 20 years ago essentially has seen no improvement in their lives for almost a generation. And the job seekers who are actually entering the job market do not see a prospect of, let me actually step back. Some of the social contract that we have with our societies is that children are supposed to be better off than their parents. That is, based on available data, not true for the majority of Iranians. I do not say that nobody is getting better off, but definitely the majority do not see an improvement over their lifetime. So as a result, that type of frustration can lead to social unrest. Whether it is the only reason, probably not. There are other factors, but that definitely is a contributing and major factor.
And we'll delve down into those other factors, but just going back to you, Ladan, what does this mean in terms of the legitimacy of the regime, not only the political legitimacy, but of course the religious legitimacy as well?
Well, in terms of political legitimacy, we saw in the paroxysmal episode of this protest, because the small protests, they engage with their officials of the region. I give you an example. For instance, farmers gathered in front of the governorate office to ask for improvement. But then, at some point, they bring a cow, and they chant, "If you can't manage the country, this cow will do better than you." The issue is that, and you hear also this in the slogans chanted during the larger nationwide protest, They say the mullah should not be involved in politics. Religion and politics should be apart. Basically, all the slogans that are, they pay homage to the founder of the Pahlavi regime. They demand a secular republic or a secular regime. Basically, you see that the nation has realized that this political system is not qualified to manage the affairs of the country. And this completely disqualification in that sense then comes to other delegitimation. For instance, they say Ayatollah Khamenei has become God, the people have become beggars, or death to Velayat Faqih, which is the cornerstone of the absolutist theocratic system of the regime.
Let's come back to that in a second, because certainly we have questions of legitimacy, we have questions of the economy, but the environment, Mehdi, is also a huge factor. Could you, and I believe the last two large protests in Isfahan and was it also in Khuzestan have been over water. So can you talk a little bit about how the environment is playing in? Perhaps it would be useful to talk about the state of the environment in recent years as well.
Right, yeah. So before getting back to the state of the protest in Iran, I think it would be good to talk about first about the state of environment in Iran, because the protest, or let's say the unrest that we are right now seeing in the country as a kind of, let's say, consequences or the symptoms of the main problem. So in general, if I'm gonna make an assumption, but this assumption is based on scientific facts. And the assumption is that if we assume the overall structure of the state of environment in Iran as a kind of social ecological system where the stakeholders, public, the water resources, air, forest, they are all related to each other. They're all interlinked, they're all interrelated. So we have seen a kind of regime changes. We have seen a kind of, let's say, passing threshold for the state of environment in Iran. So, for example, we have seen a kind of water bankruptcy in Iran. We have seen overexploitation of water resource, overexploitation of groundwater systems. So the people and the experts might ask this question. This is a very serious question. So, if we have seen regime changes in the state of environment in Iran, and if we want to make an improvement for the adaptation, and make an improvement for the resilience of the state of environment in Iran, do we need to have a kind of changing in the regime of our managerial approach as well to improve let's say our managerial system, or to improve the state of environment? That's a very serious and big question, actually. And this is exactly going back to the protest. You are seeing that for the initial first and 2 days of the protest is all about water, it's all about oil, it's all about economy. But after first and 2 days, all of the people are just targeting the entire system. All of the people are just for example, the supreme leader.
Which actually then goes back to legitimacy, but yeah. I want to bring one other institution into this, if I may. Of course, the Iran-Iraq War lasted between 1980 and 1988, and at the conclusion of the Iran-Iraq War, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps didn't want to simply go back to the barracks, and so they started investing in the civilian economy, and over subsequent decades, they become a humongous factor. Mohammad, when it comes to the role of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and how it, in a way, has distorted society and created fertile grounds for this protest movement. Is this a factor? And then I'd ask Ladan and Mehdi to jump in on this question.
So I'm going to take a relatively unorthodox approach here. Think about, so you have the economic pie, and this pie is either not growing, and at times it is shrinking. If you cannot buy the loyalty of the entire population, or a plurality or a majority of the population, you at the very least want to make sure that those segments of the population who are willing to provide support are loyal. But when I mentioned that the Iranian economy has, on per capita basis, has not grown since 2000, I mean, Iran also hasn't been under regular circumstances. Like, the Iranian economy is not really comparable to what's going on in Turkey or in Korea or even in Pakistan. The country has been under sanctions. So the sanctions, the mismanagement, and shifts in global economy away from using resources to more service-based economy overall. It has had consequences for the Iranian macroeconomics. Revolutionary Guards essentially, and they are not alone, there are other organs within and institutions within the government, they have been rewarded for their loyalty by taking a larger piece of this economic pie over years. So in that sense, production or growth are not necessarily the objective of a centralized economy like Iran. I mean, on the paper, everything is privatized, but the privatization has not led to an independent private sector. A lot of assets have been transferred to people who are guaranteed to be loyal to the system. The evidence of that is available in several studies, books, so on and so forth. The role of the Revolutionary Guards in that sense is to amass as much wealth within the system to buy the loyalty of the people who are working for them.
Is it working?
What do you mean by that?
When we see the eruption of the protest movement, for example, is the strategy of only buying specific people's loyalty working enough for the regime?
Well, the people who are protesting are not the people whose loyalty is needed.
Okay.
So, I mean, the idea is that the people who protest eventually are met with the people who are loyal.
Okay.
And they are willing to, kind of crack the proverbial heads.
Okay, I actually want to ask a question as to how this factor plays into the environment. I remember in The Economist magazine, I think it was about 15 years ago, they identified Iran as being the third largest dam building nation on earth. And of course, most of the construction for the dams, if not all, is through Khatam al-Anbiya and the economic wing of the Revolutionary Guard. So how does this dam building impact the management of the environment, and in turn, how does this lead to or impact the growing protest movement?
Mohammad made some very good points, actually. So the overall structure of the political system in Iran is rooted in some ideological policies. And it's rooted in this constitution. For example, in two articles, you are noticing that those articles are mentioning or emphasizing on self-sufficiency in food products, or for example, in agriculture products or something like that. So when you wanna, let's say, you wanna cut independence cut dependency from the other countries, for example, from the Western countries or from the Eastern countries, the first thing that you are reaching out to is your resources. It's your internal resources. So if you want to control your internal resources, which included, for example, water, which included your oil, it's the first thing is, for example, creating some structural mechanisms. And the first structural mechanism that can be considered is interbasin, for example, water transfers, or, for example, constructing dams. This is why, as you mentioned correctly, Iran has been considered as the third overall in the world in constructing dams, in the number of constructed dams. But eventually, we are talking about nature. We are talking about the environment. Somewhere and sometime, all of this process would backfire, such as what we have seen, for example, in Isfahan. You have transferred all of the, for example, water from Khuzestan, from Charmal, Bakhtiyari to Isfahan, and you increase the resources in Isfahan. And what happened there? You didn't. Let's say, first of all, you didn't put evaluation or pricing for your water. You didn't engage the people in the destination. You didn't engage people in your decision making for transferring water, and the people in Isfahan and the agriculture sector in Isfahan thought that, yeah, there is a kind of, let's say, cheap water and there is a kind of abundance of water. So the agricultural sector has been extended significantly in the past nearly 20 years. So what happened there? You are right now seeing, for example, in Isfahan is a relatively not totally dry province. It's a relatively dry province, but right now seeing cultivated rice, for example. I don't blame let's say, the farmers in Isfahan. They have been, let's say, they have been provided with those water, and they have been said that, yeah, we want to cut the dependency from the other countries, and you need to do that. You need to cultivate more because we need to be self-sufficient in our food products.
So, I mean, but is it just distortion because of subsidies, or is there something else going on here?
Yeah, because the core of the problem is that first, you have an ideological system.
Okay.
This ideological system, which is, once again, it's not, we are not talking about the authorities in charge. The thing that I'm going to say right now might be a challenge for some people, but we have some good authorities in Iran right now, even in the past few years. But the overall structure of the country, the overall structure of the political discourse in the country, so leads those authorities to make some bad decisions. Mm-hmm. We have seen some improvements in Iran. For example, we have seen some improvements for the Lake Urmia during the past nearly during the past 8 years. It was not for the Restoration Committee of Lake Urmia, there would be probably no Lake Urmia right now. But definitely, it might have been just an exception. The overall structure of the country leads to overexploitation of the water, because of the non-democratic and ideological political system that we have.
I'm going to interject here for a few things. First of all, the role of price distortions matter. People react with the incentives given to them. Then you also have to consider the fact that there are some socioeconomic decision-making going in the background for various reasons, including what Mehdi mentioned, the articles in the Constitution that demand autarky, large state of autarky for the economy. Food independence and food production independence is a paramount issue for the government. Among many countries in the world, Iran is one of the few that still sticks to economic planning. So every 5 years, they announce a 5-year economic plan. Right. And the Supreme Leader essentially tells you what he wants to see in these economic plans. One paramount constant for over 20 years, and probably much longer, is the supremacy of the agricultural sector over other sectors. Mm-hmm. So in successive 5-year economic plans, it has been mentioned that the agricultural sector and providing employment within the agricultural sector should be prioritized over other forms of development.
Okay. I actually we've opened a number of cans of worms, and there's a lot we can talk about. But when it comes to distribution of resources, when it comes to structural issues, when it comes to specific grievances, and what it takes to unite disparate groups in Iran around a single cause, one topic we haven't heard about in this conversation yet involves women. And is there any unifying factor among the women when it comes to the protest movement, or are the women simply subcategories of other grievances which ordinary Iranian people express? I mean, are the women protesting because of discrimination against women, or are they protesting because the Ziandaru in Isfahan has dried up? How do women factor in all this, the evolution of this protest movement, Ladan?
Well, I think the general discontent about the management of the country is also shared by women, but women were targeted from the beginning of the revolution as a different species, and they imposed upon them the second category of citizenship. And this has been a source of discontent from the very beginning. So I think, no, women issue is one general specific women issues because they want equality and they fight against discrimination. And the fact that they have been fighting from the beginning of the revolution, I mean, in March 8, 1979, thousands of women poured out onto the streets, and they protested against mandatory veil. They are still doing that. And this is a very important issue because at the time, the Iranian intelligentsia, and especially influenced by Marxism, didn't pay attention to the importance, anthropological importance of this issue, and women understood it. They said, this regime wants to make us become something we are not. And their identity and their dignity was at stake. And over the years, I mean, they have been battling. If you compare the images of Tehran in 1980s with 1990s, and now you will see that it's like a huge tide, silent tide, that is pushing back the regime in order to define who they are within the public space. So what women have done, I think, at first, like the other protesters, they engaged the government. In the 1990s, they tried to improve the condition of women. They gave in about the veil. They wore their scarves, and they said, we want reform of the divorce. We want the reform of other laws that are discriminating about the women. But the government doesn't answer. So at some point, the disqualification came with the campaign that was launched with My Stealthy Freedom page, when women said, okay, so we are going to act, we are going to proceed in civil disobedience where we can and individually. And they have created a movement that is really endangering the regime, because in one space, they started to use, in a very subversive manner, the virtual public space. The digital revolution provided them with a public space. They had been pushed away from the public space. In 2005 and 2006, they demonstrated in the streets, and they were pushed aside by violence. So what they did, and I think my view is absolutely genius, they said, okay, we are going to take a picture of ourselves without the veil, and this is within the physical public space, but because we cannot do that in public space, we will transform the virtual public space into the real public space. So for the first time, we realized that they created a parallel public space that is immune from police assault. And their image could be kept up and alive. So what they did with My Stealthy Freedom, I think it's really philosophically very important, is that they vanquished the regime narrative about women. So whoever now think of women in Iran, they know that there is another narrative, and this narrative is online, and they can see it. And from there, they started to go to the conquest of the real public space, physical public space, and that was the White Wednesday campaign. When they came out, they wore a white scarf and took it off and stopped to see what happens. That was a real physical civil disobedience movement. And from there, when they were assaulted, they launched My Camera is My Weapon, and this was a sort of declaration of peaceful war against the regime. Say, you are fighting me, I'm fighting back. Naming their camera the weapon is also showing a war, a peaceful war against the regime. And from there, which is very important, one of them stood up on this utility box, took off her scarves, and made a statement to the public. So a civil disobedience that may have gone unnoticed by other citizens became a statement that was noticed not only by all Iranian society, but the whole society.
I'm going to ask, because our conversation is going in that direction, about social media, about communications. As Ladan probably knows, way back when I had less gray hair and actually more hair total, I had worked, my doctoral dissertation was about the telegraph in Qajar, Iran, and so I've always been fascinated with communications. But one of the advantages of being the substitute moderator is I get to ask you questions from left field, which I haven't prepared you for as I prepare myself. And one of the issues I was looking at just in the last couple days, when I was looking at the population pyramid of Iran, I noticed something. I think 74% of Iranians were born after the revolution, which certainly makes me feel rather old. And if we add into that the people who had no memory of the revolution just because of their age, we actually have 85% of Iranians don't actually remember what it was like before the revolution. What I want to ask generally on this issue to all three of you, and just feel free to jump in, is how does this change the discussions and the dynamics of the legitimacy of the regime, which in our earlier conversation, Ladan had brought up. And the fact that we're no longer dealing with a protest movement of people that remember what it was before the regime. We just have people who have only experienced the regime who are now taking into the streets protesting. How does this dynamic change, and what's this mean for the future of Iran?
Okay, I'll go first.
Okay, please.
Yeah.
And being an economist, I have to shoehorn an economic angle into it.
Okay.
So one thing which, as you mentioned, the vast majority of Iranians do not have any physical memory of how Iran was before the revolution. And the government, as you know, anybody who goes through, the majority of people who go through the educational system, the books that they read are the only narrative that they have for the majority of their life. That broke down with the growth of social media, and it led to a couple of stark issues. It is a little known fact, even for the experts, that roughly between 1955 and 1972, Iran actually experienced one of the highest growth rates in the world. The country started very poor, but it developed quickly. And at the point of the revolution, actually, it was, in real terms, at a point that it has not surpassed since. So Iran today is substantially poorer than it was 2 generations ago. And it was not an issue that was felt or experienced by the people, the majority of people who were born after. However, with social media, it suddenly became tangible that our parents or our grandparents could actually take vacations without too much of a pressure on the budget. We were actually one of the leading countries in the region. We were substantially richer than some countries in the neighborhood that are now richer than us. This contrast, this knowledge that not only we fell down, but we haven't been able to stand up, is actually very present in the memory of particularly younger people who did not even experience the period of relative prosperity in the 1990s. So in that sense, I think that it is driving a lot of resentment or unfulfillment that they feel about the current state of affairs. I believe that you agree with that, right?
Yeah, and what I want to just intercede here is, does the impact of memory, whether it's real, whether it's myth, come into play when it comes to the environmental issue and the cognizance of the environment looking backwards?
Right. Some people, specifically the young people, might ask that. So we were a country that initiated or created the Department of Environment. That was the first Department of Environment in the Middle East in 1971, which was just 1 year after creating or developing EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, in 1970 in the United States. So from that standpoint, why right now we are here? So I'm not talking about that. So if the previous regime right now was in charge right now, so there would be no problem, everything would be fine. That's not absolutely true. We still had some problems. But people might think that, specifically the young people might ask that. So I believe that the Iranian people are super smart. Specifically during the process, we have seen that. So they have targeted the overall structure of the overall structure of the political system, not specifically just, for example, just some authorities or just some, let's say, some specific goals. So we have seen that the people are targeting or just are thinking about the overall discourse of the ideological system in Iran, which was not in place before the revolution. Before the revolution, definitely we didn't have a kind of diversity of economy, but definitely we didn't have a kind of ideological political system. Having a kind of ideological political system change your priorities. Changing your priorities can let's say distract or let's say cannot construct constructive foreign policy with the other countries. When you do not have a constructive foreign policy with the other countries, definitely it would affect your economy as well. When you're affected with the economy, you're putting more pressure on your resources, including water. Then this is why you're right now seeing that the people, specifically young people, are focusing on the water shortage in association with the overall structure of the country, not because of some climate change or not because of the sanctions or something like that. They can be some kind of catalyst. They can be some kind of catalyst in let's say, in worsening the situation, but definitely not the main problem.
In our last few minutes, because I want to reserve some time for questions and answers from the audience, I actually want to circle back to what Ladan was saying at the beginning with regard to questions of legitimacy. First of all, before you make your interjection here, when it came to religious legitimacy, you had told me something fascinating in the green room with regard to a comparison between what Iran is going through now versus the history of the church.
Yes. The question of, when we see the disqualification of the regime in the protest, there are also, along with this and in parallel, tectonic cultural changes that are taking place. People are being killed, assassinated, flogged, fined. Their living has been, as you all said, completely going down. They say this is our religion. So what has happened in Iran, right, that are little noticed, especially by policymakers, and I think this is absolutely crucial when you want to understand a polity with which you are to interact. This is a religious regime. Any religious issue and change, it's crucial for you to understand this regime. What has happened in Iran is two-edged crisis, religious. One is within religion, and Ayatollah Khamenei has been warning about secularist Hawza, religious seminaries, because political Islam is completely being rejected within the religious seminaries. You have a bunch of reformists now that are, in the name of Islam, are promoting secular democracy. We can name them Kadivar, Mujtahid Shabestari, and these people have, their idea is taken up by the younger mullahs. Why it is so, and why the regime is so worried about the change in Hawza? Give me 5 minutes because it's very important.
Well, I just want you to enunciate what you actually told me in the green room.
Yes, I'm going to
okay.
I'm getting there. Because the Hawza see that people are turning away from Islam. And the conversion to Christianity, you should know that the highest rate of conversion to Christianity in the world is in Iran. And this is a crucial importance. Before the revolution, 500 people of Muslim background were converted to Islam. That was where, well, the churches were pretty free, not really to proselytize, but they were not assassinated. Priests were not assassinated. Churches were free, etc. In 2005, this number had grown to 40,000, and by now it's around 1 million.
Wow.
And this is crucial because when you read the census in Iran, they say 90% Shia, 10% Sunni, 0 some percent Jews and Christian and Zoroastrian. I commissioned, and we worked together with a polling institute in the Netherlands, and we launched a polling about the attitude of Iranians towards religion. 50,000 people from inside Iran participated, and the participants were weighed based on the demographic categories. These are technicalities, but the responses were very, very interesting. And I think it's important to understand an Islamic Republic, to understand what the Islamic Republic has done to the religion of the Iranian people. Let me give you the number.
Just bottom line up front, because we also need to take time for the audience.
Yeah. Okay,
So,
quickly.
30 seconds.
78% of the Iranian believe in God. 37% believe in life after death. 30% believe in heaven and hell, 26% believe in, only 26% believe in the coming of the Savior. Now, around 20% don't believe in anything, but more crucially, 32.2% identify themselves as Shia Muslim, 5% as Sunni Muslim, 8.8% identify as atheist. And this is amazing cultural and anthropological change. 1.5% Christians, which corroborate the number by the Christian Church. 2.7% define themselves as humanist. 5.8% are agnostic. 7.1% believe in spirituality. 7.7% declare themselves to be Zoroastrian. So these are extremely important. Iran is not, there is no absolute religious majority in Iran.
My last question to the panel before opening to the audience, therefore, is all of you in different ways, whether it's economic, whether it's environmental, whether it's religious and social, have depicted in Iran and a regime which has been losing, if not hemorrhaging, the legitimacy. Is this pattern reversible? Or as we near a transition because of the end of the life of Ali Khamenei, is this a situation where the regime is headed to a crisis from which it won't be able to recover? And keep your answers brief because I really do want to get to the audience.
Yep. So just last point. The problem right now that we are seeing in our water resources, in our environment, is exactly the same problem that we are seeing right now in our economy. The symptoms are the same in our, let's say, in our foreign policy, in our internal policy. The symptoms are the same and the causes are the same. So you cannot fix the environment sector, the water sector without fixing your economy, without fixing your foreign policy, without fixing your internal policy decision making. So when you are talking about all of these parts, all of these sectors, you would be facing with just one thing, and that's the Constitution. So after that, you want to see, so if I need to, let's say, have a kind of ideological system, not democratic system, a non-diversity economy, what would it be then the next step? The people might ask this question from themselves. What would the next step? Can we do that through the current constitution from the current political system or not? Do we need reforms? Do we need further things rather than reforms? That's the main question that needs to be addressed.
Lots of questions. What's your take on this?
So generally speaking, when economists talk, you do not hear them being Cassandras about the environment. I'm actually going to play that. Certain trends, if they continue for long enough, may not be reversible.
Okay.
And the problem that, the abuse of the environment in Iran has gotten to the point that if there is not serious course correction, unfortunately, you may see irreversible damage. And that can, I'm not talking about the legitimacy of the government, you may have the level of environmental damage that can lead to large-scale population movements.
If I may, I just want to clarify. Is the environment one of these issues that can unify Iranians across ethnicity, across religion, across political trend, and so forth? Is this the unifying factor, and is that why the regime is so sensitive about it?
I cannot answer that question, but what I can say is that for the average person who lives in that country, they should be alarmed about the environmental trends because that's sooner or later it is going to threaten their livelihood. Okay. At a very guttural, visceral, basic level, you're not going to have water, and you're not going to have clean air, and you are at the point that you may not even be able to reverse that trend.
Okay, and Ladan, last word from you before we go to the audience.
Well, first of all, the loss of legitimacy is acknowledged by the regime's security apparatus. Mm-hmm. They acknowledge in an amazing article by two police academy associate professor, they say we have lost our control over the thoughts and mind of the people in Iran, and this is because the narrative now, their narrative or their reference comes from outside Iran, and they of course they accuse Americans, and by accusing Americans they accuse freedom of speech and open sources. What they find is they can't find a solution because what they are is what they are. And the only solution they find is censorship and violence. And that's violence we saw in 2019 when they gave the order to, first of all, to cut off the internet and to shoot to kill demonstrators. So if you want the unifying issue is in Iran, to me, against the background of economics and environmental crisis, is that people do not believe in this regime anymore. And they know that this regime is not appropriate for their lives. This is the unifying regime. The other is the perception and empowerment of the people around a project. This is our issue.
Okay. As some of you know, I'm married to a Soviet refugee, and there's an old Soviet joke about the difference between an optimist and a pessimist, where the Russian pessimist is the one who said, you know, things have never been so bad. I mean, war, bad economy, political instability, lack of legitimacy. Things couldn't possibly get worse. And the Russian optimist is the one, of course, who says, you know, things could always get worse. And so I want to leave this panel on an optimistic note, but we have about 8 minutes left. So I'd like to take some questions from the audience, and we're going to play Jeopardy in a way in which phrase your statement in the form of a question, and you can ask as many questions as you want, but we're only going to answer the first one, so let's not bother with the whole list. And then if someone from NUFDI could help with the microphone and so forth. There's actually a microphone behind you, sir. If you could get up and go to the microphone, and I'll call on people as they go to the microphones.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Michael, for not abiding by what you said, and you were heard, and not only seen. Able job moderating. Dr. Jahan-Parvar said the ones who protest are not needed. That would be comforting for the regime about its load-bearing structures. But is it? With 800 intelligence officers in jail, you know when you start the purge, 10 times that, get nervous. With events happening in Iran, from assassinations to the nuclear sites, to stealing of very confidential documents safely guarded, does that mean that those who are protesting are not the ones who are needed? Does that not mean that the termites are beginning to devour the load-bearing structures of the regime?
Okay, thank you. And I'll ask for Mohammad to answer this as the next person who has a question goes up to the microphone.
Okay, so definitely the stability of a regime is not my area of expertise. What I can tell is that from the point of view of what we see, the actual trends taking place, the government has prioritized the loyalty of people who are willing to support over the well-being of the people who are maybe not unlikely, but their absolute loyalty is in question. That we can see, and that that's what I reported. Whether it is something that is buying the loyalty of the vast majority is needed, I cannot answer that question. I'm
going to throw the same question to Ladan about the general stability of the regime, especially, I mean, I remember in, I guess, December 2018, 2019 timeframe, there were pictures online of people tearing up, members of the Besieged tearing up their identity cards and so forth. So could you comment on the same issue? And again, if there's any other questions, please head toward the microphone.
You know, there is an image that I think what is happening in the Islamic Republic is pretty much comparable to the Soviet Union, right, where the cadre of the regime didn't believe in it anymore. They were there only, or they didn't believe it. And there is an image that is very revealing. And this is when Ahmadinejad came to power, he had this social security or public safety project that was to clean up the corruption of the people. Yeah. And police was attacking people, parties, or everything. And the man who was in charge of this project was caught organizing a prayer, collective prayer, where he was praying and prostitutes naked were praying behind him. And this video was sneaked out and the man was eliminated. But for a man who is in charge of the morality of the public to do this, it shows you what is the state of the ideological loyalty of the people. I'm not talking about their financial or pecuniary loyalty.
Okay, next question. If you could also identify yourself as you ask the question,
Sure.
it would be helpful for the audience.
Sure. I'm Mohammad Yazdi from Voice of America. Mehdi, I have a question about the water bankruptcy in Iran. Recently, we have seen many articles about climate change. They try to portray climate change as a main reason of water bankruptcy in Iran and try to even find relationship between this recent flooding in the south of Iran with other countries. What do you think about that? Do you think climate change has a major impact on water bankruptcy in Iran or not?
Right. So climate change and the effects of climate change in Iran, just like the other places in the world, is both, I believe, complicated and complex. So at the same time that we know that the air temperature is going to rise in the future, the intensity of the storms would be greater in the future. And at the same time, we have seen several articles, scientific articles from several prominent scientists, Dr. Agha Kuchak, Dr. Madani, and other people, that for example, in some specific area and for specific catastrophes, for example, Lake Urmia or Karkh River Basin, we know that the climate change was not the main cause. The main cause was mismanagement due to the overall political system that we have, due to the political, let's say, to make it better, to the political governance that we have. So about the recent flooding that you mentioned, it can be or it can be not. It can be act as a catalyst, but it's very complicated to evaluate. But at the same time, we know that we have increased the population in those areas. We have increased the imperviousness surfaces in those areas. Those all can contribute to the flooding issues. So definitely, and to put it in a nutshell, climate change can act as a catalyst, but definitely not the main cause of the water bankruptcy in Iran.
Okay, without ta'aruf, I want to actually thank everyone on the panel because I do think it was a fantastic panel, insight from different perspectives, which again don't necessarily give a great deal of optimistic hope for the future. But at the same time, perhaps we can be optimistic in the American sense with regard to the declining legitimacy of the regime and the fact that change seems increasingly to be on the horizon. While in the United States, oftentimes we make Iran and Iran policy into a political football, the fact of the matter is Iranians themselves have agency. They are the dominant players in determining their future. And from what we've heard from our experts, from Ladan, from Mehdi, from Mohammed, with regard to the future, there are a lot of trends to be paying attention to inside Iran. And so I'd like to just call for one big round of applause for our panel. And again, I'd like to thank Dr. Saeed Ganji and the board of the National Union for Democracy in Iran for putting together a wonderful program. And with that, I want to actually conclude my panel so that I can't be blamed after the fact for being the person that led for us to be off schedule. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our esteemed panelists. As we